What if, in your finest hour, you laughed at the wrong person? What if the woman you mocked, humiliated, and discarded like nothing turned out to own the ground you stood on tonight? In a ballroom dripping with arrogance and polished cruelty, the world will learn a lesson it cannot afford to forget. Power does not announce itself, and when it strikes back, no one is spared. Watch carefully, because what you miss today could destroy you tomorrow. The Grand Marston Hotel shimmered like a palace of glass and gold under the late afternoon sun, its private gala buzzing with the city's richest and most powerful names. Executives, celebrities, heirs whose lives were stitched in gold thread from birth. Limousines lined the entrance, velvet ropes holding back the flashes of paparazzi, while inside, laughter and clinking champagne glasses echoed against vaulted ceilings. Amidst the river of designer gowns and tuxedos, a woman slipped through the side corridor, unnoticed at first. She wore a simple navy dress, no jewelry except a tiny silver locket, her hair tied back in a neat bun. Her name was Claire Weston. She moved with quiet grace, clutching an old leather handbag that looked achingly out of place amid the glitter and sparkle. Within seconds, the heads turned, first in curiosity, then in disdain. A blonde woman in a glittering Prada dress leaned into her friend, her voice slicing through the music like a knife. "Did someone lose their nanny?" Giggles followed, light and cruel. A young man in a sharp, tailored suit laughed openly. "She must have won a raffle or something. Should we call security before she steals the silverware?" Claire heard every word. She kept walking, chin slightly lifted, heart hammering against her ribs. Her invitation trembled slightly in her hand. Real, printed on thick ivory cardstock. But under their stares, it felt as fragile as glass. As Claire moved deeper into the ballroom, the scorn sharpened into open mockery. A woman dripping in diamonds blocked her path near the champagne tower, pretending to stumble and nearly spilling her drink onto Claire's dress, laughing with theatrical apology. "Oh dear, I didn't see you there. You blend right into the floor." Another man, young and brash, pretended to offer her a drink, then at the last second pulled it away, causing another chorus of snickering. Everywhere she turned, she was met with sneers, smirks, and cruel whispers that sliced deeper than any blade. "Maybe she's here to clean up after us," someone said, loud enough for the surrounding group to hear, and burst into laughter. Claire tightened her grip on her handbag. The ornate chandeliers overhead blurred slightly as unshed tears stung her eyes, but she refused to blink, refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing her crack. Her fingers brushed the locket around her neck. A tiny source of comfort, a reminder of who she really was, and why she had come, somewhere across the ballroom. A few heads turned toward a stage being set up for an announcement. Claire knew what was coming. She had waited years for this moment. She only needed to endure a little longer. The lights dimmed, and a hush swept through the hall. Claire took a step forward, aiming to find a quiet spot near the back. But, just as she moved, a woman in a crimson gown deliberately tripped her, sending Claire stumbling into a decorative fountain at the edge of the hall. A loud splash echoed, gasps, and then laughter, ruthless, merciless. Cameras flashed, phones raised. Claire struggled to her feet, soaked and shivering, her navy dress clinging awkwardly to her skin. Murmurs swept through the glittering crowd like wildfire. "Pathetic," someone sneered. "Just look at her. Who let her in here?" "Security," another voice barked. Claire stood frozen under the bright, merciless lights, 1,000 judgmental eyes drilling into her, every inch of her humiliation immortalized on live streams and social media feeds. One guard approached, speaking into his earpiece. "Yeah, we've got a situation. Possible crasher." Another guest, a woman with icy blue eyes and a cruel smile, pointed an accusing finger. "Throw her out before she embarrasses the gala further." Claire opened her mouth to speak, to protest, but the words stuck in her throat like shards of glass. The walls seemed to close in around her. The music, the laughter, the cruelty. It was deafening. Before the guard could lay a hand on Claire, A sudden commotion erupted near the main entrance. The grand oak doors slammed open with a thunderous crack, and a wave of suited men flooded into the ballroom, their earpieces glinting under the chandelier light, moving with purpose, parting the stunned crowd like a blade slicing through silk. At their center walked a man whose mere presence seemed to change the temperature of the room. Tall, commanding, eyes as sharp as broken glass, Mr. Harrison Ward, the CEO of Ward Global Industries, was a man whose empire spanned continents, whose name alone sent stocks soaring or crumbling with a single word. The laughter died instantly, replaced by a suffocating silence so thick it pressed down on every chest. Harrison Ward's gaze swept the room, assessing, dissecting, until it landed on Claire. Drenched, trembling, humiliated. In 3 long strides, he crossed the floor, coming to stand directly before her, ignoring the stares, the cameras, the whispered confusion. Then, in a voice that carried the weight of judgment itself, he spoke. "Claire Weston," he said, loud enough for every soul in the ballroom to hear. "You should not have had to introduce yourself tonight, but since no one here showed the decency or intelligence to recognize you, allow me to make it perfectly clear." He turned to face the crowd, his expression carved from ice. "Ladies and gentlemen, allow me to present the sole heir of the Weston Ward fortune, daughter of Eleanor Weston, legal beneficiary of a legacy that dwarfs every other name in this room combined." Gasps exploded like gunfire through the hall. Phones dropped from limp hands. Faces paled. The same woman in the crimson dress who had tripped Claire moments before now stumbled backward, her mouth opening and closing soundlessly like a fish gasping for air. Harrison wasn't finished. His voice, cold and merciless, continued to slice through the pretense. "The next time you choose to humiliate someone based on their appearance, pray it is not someone whose influence could erase your existence with a single phone call." Claire stood still, water dripping from her hair onto the marble floor, but now she was no longer the object of pity. She was a force of nature revealed, the quiet storm whose arrival they had mocked until it was far too late. The guard who had reached for her earlier stepped back, his face ashen. Guests who had laughed now cowered, wishing they could vanish into the floor. A hush fell over the room, so absolute it seemed the chandeliers themselves dared not sway. In that silence, Claire finally lifted her head fully, her eyes meeting Harrison's with quiet gratitude, then sweeping across the faces of those who had belittled her. Not with hatred, not even with anger, but with the serene, devastating certainty of someone who no longer needed to explain herself to anyone. The tension in the air crackled so thick it was almost visible, an electric charge hanging over the glittering room of once arrogant elites now standing frozen in their designer shoes, their gazes ricocheting between Claire and Harrison like deer trapped in the headlights of an oncoming storm. But Harrison Ward wasn't finished dismantling their illusions. He stepped aside, giving Claire the floor, his very movement a silent coronation, and for a moment Claire simply stood there, soaked but unbowed, the fragile girl they thought they had crushed, now replaced by something infinitely stronger, infinitely more dangerous. Slowly, deliberately, Claire reached into her battered leather handbag and withdrew a single folded document. She unfolded it with hands that no longer trembled, revealing a legally stamped deed, the ink fresh, gleaming under the chandelier light. Harrison spoke again, his voice low, lethal. "Tonight's gala was sponsored by the Marston Foundation, wasn't it?" he asked. Though it wasn't truly a question, several committee members nodded hesitantly. "And this hotel," Harrison continued, "was recently sold in a quiet acquisition deal finalized yesterday morning." Gasps rippled again, more frantic this time, some faces twisting in dawning horror. Claire held up the deed high enough for everyone to see, her voice steady as she finally spoke. "Effective immediately. I am the sole owner of the Grand Marston Hotel." A beat of stunned silence, then chaos. Whispers turned to frantic murmuring, committee heads pulling out their phones, scrolling desperately for confirmation, their faces turning ash gray as news alerts popped up, confirming every word, the very ground they stood on. The place where they had mocked her, humiliated her. No longer belonged to them. It belonged to her. Claire Weston, the woman they had laughed at, now owned the building beneath their feet, the contracts above their heads, the very future of the institutions they clung to so desperately. The woman in the crimson dress let out a soft, broken sound, half a sob, half a plea, as if she realized too late that she hadn't just insulted a nobody. She had insulted her new landlord, her new gatekeeper to every elite event in the city. Claire surveyed the room with eyes colder than ice, colder than vengeance, but somehow still achingly calm, almost pitying. She didn't need to shout. She didn't need to humiliate them in return. The truth had already done it for her, written across every pale, sweating, desperate face in the room, and in that devastating, glorious silence, Claire Weston, the woman they had dismissed as nothing, became the most powerful person they had ever met. The silence didn't last long. It cracked beneath the weight of reality like thin glass under boot heels. One by one, the self-appointed royalty of the room began to panic. The event host, a smug, silver-haired man who had snickered the loudest when Claire fell into the fountain, rushed forward, plastering on a crooked smile, his tone suddenly sweet as syrup. "Miss Weston, if there's been a misunderstanding, we'd be happy to—" But Harrison stepped forward first, cutting him off with a single raised hand. "You mean the misunderstanding where you publicly humiliated the rightful owner of this venue and the heir to the Weston Ward legacy in front of 200 witnesses?" The man's mouth hung open uselessly. Harrison turned slightly, addressing a sharply dressed woman standing near the bar. "Denise Lowell, planning committee chair, correct?" She blinked. "Yes, Mr. Ward, You're fired," Claire said flatly, her voice soft but lethal, slicing through the air like silk-wrapped steel. "Effective immediately. Your access to Marston events is permanently revoked. Security will escort you out." Gasps rippled again as two guards, the same ones who had earlier tried to remove Claire, now approached Denise with grim, dutiful expressions. Claire turned to them, voice calm but clear. "And you two, I know you were just following instructions, but the moment you put your hands on a guest without verification, you broke every code of professional conduct. Hand in your badges at the back office. You're done." The taller guard swallowed hard. "Miss Weston, we didn't know—" "Exactly," Claire said, eyes unwavering. "And you didn't care to find out." The crowd shifted, restless, some trying to quietly slip away. But Claire's voice rose one last time, commanding and undeniable. "No one leaves, not yet." All eyes turned to her again, stunned that she had taken control of a room that once tried to erase her. "Tonight, you all showed me exactly who you are. And I want you to remember that it wasn't the money, the clothes, or the status that exposed you. It was your choice." She stepped forward, drenched dress clinging to her like armor. "From this moment forward, the Weston Ward Foundation will be reevaluating every donation, every board member, every contract. If you mocked me tonight, if you stood by and laughed, don't expect another cent, another invitation, another favor, not from me, not from my family, not from the empire you so casually spat on." The room collapsed into a vacuum of guilt, fear, and irreversible regret. Those who had wielded wealth like a weapon were now stripped of its protection, exposed by the woman they tried to silence. And there would be no mercy, no second chance, no forgetting what they had done. As the weight of justice settled over the room like a final gavel, Claire's gaze shifted. No longer sharp with judgment, but calm, searching, like someone looking for the single light that hadn't flickered out in a storm. And she found it. Near the far wall stood a young server, still in his black vest and white gloves, half hidden behind the champagne cart. His name tag read Evan, and earlier, when no one else had even made eye contact with her, he had quietly offered her a napkin when she was soaked, whispered a gentle, "Are you okay?" when the crowd wasn't watching. Claire stepped down from the raised floor, her wet shoes clicking softly against the marble as the stunned crowd watched her walk straight toward the most invisible person in the room. Evan stiffened, eyes wide, as she approached. "You help me," she said simply. Her voice no longer just steady. Oh, it was warm. When everyone else was laughing, you didn't look away. He nodded, speechless. Harrison appeared beside her like a shadow of authority, already pulling a sleek black envelope from his inside pocket. "This," Claire said, handing it to Evan, "is a full scholarship. Any university, any field, fully covered, starting tomorrow if you want it." Evan's mouth opened, but no words came, only a sharp gasp of disbelief as the envelope trembled in his hands. Claire turned to the staff behind the bar, two women who had subtly redirected the fountain spray when she fell, shielding her from further humiliation without saying a word. "And both of you, your salaries will triple if you accept a transfer to the executive wing of Weston Ward's hospitality division. We're building a new future. I want it filled with people who know how to recognize humanity when no one else does." Cries of joy, real, breathless, broke through the stunned quiet. Someone in the crowd began to clap, then another, and another, but this time, it wasn't forced. I wasn't nervous. It was genuine. It was for the people who had shown kindness without knowing there would be a reward, for those whose decency had survived the cruelty of the room. Claire turned back one last time to face the elites, the same people who had laughed from behind flutes of champagne. "If any of you are wondering why kindness matters, it's because power, real power, remembers." Then she looked at Evan again, her expression soft. "And so does gratitude." The room, once drunk on arrogance, now stood in quiet awe of the truth that while cruelty demands attention, it is kindness, unseen, uncelebrated, inconvenient, that earns loyalty, legacy, and light. The clapping faded into a deep, reverent silence, the kind that only follows a seismic shift, the kind that feels sacred and irreversible. Claire stood still for a moment, letting the silence breathe, letting it settle deep into the bones of everyone present. Then she turned, stepped lightly back onto the small stage near the center of the ballroom, her wet dress leaving faint footprints on the polished marble. And yet, she walked with the bearing of a queen, unbothered, unbreakable. She didn't need a microphone. Her voice carried through the cavernous hall, clear and piercing as a bell. "Tonight, you showed me who you are," she said, her gaze sweeping across the crowd. "But more importantly, you showed yourselves. No one dared to move. No one dared to breathe too loudly." Claire's voice never wavered, steady and sharp. "You measured me by the price of my shoes, the shine of my jewelry, the cut of my dress, and you found me lacking. You decided my value at a glance, then discarded me like trash." Her words hit like hammer blows, each syllable stripping away the last illusions still clinging to the crowd. "But you were wrong." She stepped closer to the edge of the platform, her soaked hem brushing the toes of those in the front row. Yet no one dared step back. "Worth," she said, "is not stitched into a label. It is not engraved into a bank account. Worth is lived. It is fought for. It is earned. In silence, in struggle, in moments when no one is watching and there is no applause waiting at the end." Claire's hand brushed the silver locket at her throat, the only piece of jewelry she had worn all night, and she smiled, not with bitterness, but with something purer, a kind of tragic, luminous clarity. "I was rich long before I inherited anything, rich in integrity, rich in grit, rich in everything that cannot be bought, cannot be stolen, cannot be faked." Her voice dropped lower, carrying even more power in its restraint. "If you ever doubt someone's value again based on what they wear or how they look, remember tonight. Remember that you looked a future empire in the eye and tried to crush it because it didn't glitter the way you expected." Murmurs rippled through the crowd, but none dared raise their voices in protest, for the truth hung too heavily now, undeniable and absolute. Claire lifted her chin, her final words slicing clean through the remaining air. Next time you meet someone who doesn't shine the way you want them to, look closer. You might be standing in the shadow of a king, or a queen, or something far greater than you'll ever comprehend. And with that, Claire stepped down from the stage, leaving her words ringing in the marble and the gold and the guilt-soaked silence. A permanent scar etched into the hearts of everyone who had thought themselves better, louder, richer, and now knew, with sickening certainty, that they had only ever been smaller. The crowd parted once again, but this time not out of disdain, out of reverence, out of a deep, instinctive understanding that something greater had passed among them, something they had not deserved but had been forced to witness. Claire moved through the silence, her head high, her steps sure, the remnants of her soaked dress trailing behind her like a banner of victory, each footprint a silent testament to resilience no ridicule could ever erase. Staff members bowed their heads respectfully as she passed, some placing a hand over their hearts, others simply watching her with wide, newly awakened eyes, as if seeing not just her but the parts of themselves they had long since buried under fear and ambition. Evan, the young server, stood near the door, still clutching the scholarship envelope to his chest like a life raft, his face shining with something raw and beautiful. Hope, unleashed at last. Claire paused beside him, resting a gentle hand on his shoulder, a silent promise that kindness was never wasted, that it was the seed from which entire futures could bloom. She stepped out into the cool night air, the city stretching before her like a vast, glittering map, no longer hostile, no longer unreachable, but open, waiting, alive. Above her, the stars blinked against the velvet sky, ancient and patient, bearing silent witness to the moment when everything changed. Not because she had shouted, or fought, or demanded, but because she had stood, unyielding, unbreakable, when it would have been easier to disappear. Claire took a deep breath, the air crisp and sharp in her lungs, filling every corner of the hollow spaces cruelty had tried to carve out of her. She smiled, small and true. This was not just a victory. This was a beginning, somewhere deep inside the hotel. Phones were ringing, partnerships dissolving, reputations crumbling under the weight of their own arrogance. But Claire didn't look back. She didn't need to. Her future wasn't waiting behind her. It was unfurling before her, vast and unstoppable. And with every step she took into the night, the echoes of the ballroom faded, replaced by the steady, certain drumbeat of a life that would be lived entirely on her own terms. Long after Claire Weston disappeared into the night, long after the gilded walls of the Grand Marston Hotel ceased to echo with laughter and cruelty, a different kind of silence settled. Not the silence of ignorance, but the heavy, soul-deep silence of reckoning. Those who had mocked her would never forget the taste of their own shame, bitter and thick on their tongues. They would remember the way she stood, soaked and shining like a weapon the world had tried to dull but failed to break. They would remember that power, true power, does not scream or demand. It simply is, undeniable, unshakable, self-born. Claire had not needed vengeance. Her dignity had been sharper than any blade, her grace heavier than any crown, and now her shadow would stretch over them for years to come, a quiet reminder that wealth without character is nothing but empty noise, and that kindness, invisible though it may seem, holds the keys to every locked door. Somewhere, a girl in a second-hand dress would see herself differently. Somewhere, a boy working 2 jobs to pay tuition would lift his head a little higher. Somewhere, a stranger would pause before judging another soul by the shoes they wore or the car they drove, because they would remember. They would remember her, Claire Weston, the woman who walked into a ballroom full of kings and queens and made them kneel without raising her voice, the woman who showed a broken world that true worth is never worn. It is carried, quietly, fiercely, by those who refuse to let the darkness of others extinguish their own light. She said nothing. She demanded nothing. She simply stood, and the world shattered around her. Remember this. The quiet ones carry storms inside them. The modest ones write the endings you never see coming. Next time you laugh, next time you judge, Next time you turn your back on someone who dares to look ordinary, know this: you might be kneeling before them sooner than you think.